Glad you're here. I've got books at the front. If you have not grabbed a book, you can grab one of those before the night's out. You won't really need it this evening, but you can get one on the way out if you need one. There's an outline, packet of notes. I've got a few up here, and I think Corey put some in the back if you need them. In your book, there's a schedule for the whole course this fall. And I just want to mention a couple of things. We're reading a book called The Universe Next Door by James Sire. It's in its 6th go-around of printing, which tells you that it's a good book and people like it. Those two things don't always go together. Sometimes people like bad books, and sometimes the opposite is not true. But it's a solid book, and people have enjoyed reading it and benefited from it. And if you were to take some sort of basic level philosophy, worldview class at a Bible college, a lot of them would use this as the textbook. So that's what we're using. And when I put these together for you guys, these institute classes, I'm trying to approach the same topic a number of different ways. So that's why I'm giving you a book. I hope you read it. If you don't read it, I'll never know the difference. It's not like there's an exam or you're signing an oath or anything like that. But I hope you read it because I'm putting stuff in front of you that's solid. So you can read the material in the book. We're going to talk about it when we come in here on Tuesday nights. I'm giving you see on the schedule, a video each week that dovetails, piggybacks on, goes along with whatever it is that we're talking about week to week. And so the video this week is James Anderson, What's Your Worldview? You can find it on YouTube, Ligonier Ministries, and I give you the date so you can search all that stuff up. So it's good to hear the same thing from multiple voices. So that's why I give you those videos. And then the last week, we did this with preaching, and it was very straightforward with preaching. The last week, we're going to have guys preach. But the last week of our Worldview class, we are going to have an opportunity for you to share with us. And that last week is going to look a little bit different than the last night of preaching class did, but we'll come to that in a little bit. And again, the point in that last night of class is not just I couldn't think of anything to say the fourth week. It's really to say that's a great way to learn something. Like if you're going to learn preaching, you should listen and read, and then you should preach and actually do it. And if you're talking about worldview, you should read a little and you should listen a little, and then hopefully some of you guys will be eager to stand up and do some worldview analysis. So we'll talk about that. One correction on this schedule that I want to draw your attention to, as far as assigned reading, on Tuesday, October 12th, it says chapters 5 to 9. I intended that to say 5 and 9. So rather than a dash, a comma, or a slash, or something like that. Chapter 6, 7, and 8 are really good. And if you really want a deep dive, a deep dig on some worldview stuff that can really make your head hurt, jump into those chapters and wade right in. But those are challenging chapters. And so as we think about the course of the class, the chapters that we're going to stick with are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 9, 11, and 12. And to be honest with you, the chapters I've put on this course schedule are the chapters that you might have some likelihood of encountering somebody who has that worldview. And those middle chapters, there's a lot of people on the planet who hold those worldviews, but the likelihood of rubbing shoulders with them in Odessa, Texas is not zero, but it's much lower than some of the other things that we're going to discuss. So there's a sort of an overview schedule for the class. The aim of these classes, I talked to you about this last time when we talked about preaching. The aim of these classes pulls from 2 Timothy 2:2, and I'll throw it up on the screen for you. Paul says, what you have heard from me in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. So Paul's writing to his protege, Timothy. Timothy's reading a letter from his mentor, Paul. And one of the calls from Paul to Timothy is this 4-generation passing down of the faith. And in that verse, there's 4 generations. There's Paul. Timothy heard some things from Paul. He passed through Timothy's hometown on a mission trip. He looped back around later and picked him up and took him on a mission trip, took him under his wing. He was a spiritual father. Paul is passing things down to Timothy. That's the you, what you have heard from me, Paul. And Timothy heard it in the presence of many witnesses. Timothy is supposed to take that content and give it to faithful men with the intention that the faithful men will then give it to others also. And that's an important progression when you think about teaching. It's one thing to teach people content. It's another thing entirely to teach people how to teach content, which is why I would loop back to that 4th week when some of you will have the opportunity to stand up and do worldview analysis. Part of the reason we're going to do some version of that in every institute class is that this is the call in local church ministry, is to teach men, that's what we're doing here, the content of the gospel, the faith once for all delivered to the saints, and to do it in a way that you can turn around and pass it down to your families, to your children, to your wives, to people in your Sunday school class, to other folks that you meet in everyday life. So that's our aim. My approach in this is just to sort of lecture or teach as you might get in a Bible college type setting. We're obviously only meeting 4 times, so it's not like a true college course where you have quite as many face-to-face hours of instruction, but that's the broad approach. So we're talking about worldview. And just to begin, let's just talk broad strokes, big picture, introduction to worldview. It is a remarkable thing to stop and think about the fact that so many people on planet Earth, we all live on the same planet. We all live on the same rock. Many of us live on the same continent. We breathe the same air. If you've traveled overseas, you know that we prepare our food differently and we flavor it differently, but it's mostly the same stuff mixed up differently and prepared differently. I mean, we eat the same basic stuff. We live in the same place, we breathe the same air, we eat the same food, we have families, we get married, we have kids, we have jobs, we do all that stuff the same, but we look at life and we view the world in drastically different ways. And I'll just give you some stereotypical people for you to put in your brain and think about the differences in the way that these people view the world, okay? Let's take a typical white evangelical who lives in the United States smack in the middle of the Bible Belt. I know it's hard for you to imagine somebody like that, but do your best, okay? Just a classic American Christian, lives in the Bible Belt, believes the Bible is true, wants to honor God with his life. Contrast that with the fundamentalist Muslims. You could point to a lot of different countries. Maybe with the news this week, we'll point to Afghanistan. Somebody in the Taliban. They view the world very differently than you do. Very, very differently. Contrast that with the witch doctor in the jungle of Brazil who has had very little contact with anybody from the outside, quote, outside world. Now you've got a third view of the world that is very, very different than the first two. Now let's go to Germany, where they're really strict in the airport and they'll yell at you if you don't follow their rules when you're traveling during a pandemic. Let's go to Germany and let's go to a university and let's meet a naturalistic, atheistic evolutionist who teaches in a university. Now you have another completely different worldview. They live on the same planet that we live on. They breathe the same air. They do the same basic thing every day. They wake up, they work, they try to do something productive, they get tired, they go to sleep. They're trying to get through life, but they view the world very, very differently than we do. Now let's go down to India. Let's go to India where there are more gods than people, and watch somebody bowing down to a statue, burning incense, ringing bells, not wanting to harm the cow, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, those are people who live on the same planet, and they look at life on the same planet and they view it completely differently from each other. They all get married, they all have kids, They all do their best to keep their kids alive and then get their kids out of their house in one way or another. We have a lot of things in common, but the way that we view the world is completely different. Now that's comparing cultures around the world. Now let's just compare cultures within the United States. Polls tell you, if you believe polls, that something like 80 to 90% of Americans believe in God. It's not putting any definition on God. It's not qualifying who he is or what he's like, but it's just saying, do you believe in God? Is there a higher power? Is there a deity? The overwhelming majority of Americans say, yes, I would affirm that. And yet, politically, we're not an 80-20 country. We're not a 90-10 country. We're pretty much a 51-49 country, depending on the year. And things just come right down the middle. And we're all living in the same country. We're all using the same money. We're going through the same educational process. And yet we end up looking at the world in drastically different ways. People disagree about political ideology. What should our presidents, our governors, our congressmen, our senators, what should they do? People disagree about the afterlife. Who gets to go to heaven? How do you get there? How do you know who gets to go there and why they get to go there? People disagree about the exclusivity of Christ. People disagree about the value of human life. There's all this disagreement. We live in the same place. We experience the same things, and yet we don't process it in the same way. The biblical answer to that, explaining why that is the way it is, would be sin. Biblically, we would say sin is a problem in the world. In Romans 1, Paul lays that out very clearly, right? He's talking about the effects of sin and fallenness on mankind, and he lays it out in Romans 1 so clearly. He says, they know the truth about God, but they suppress it and they push it down, and it leads them into idolatry, and it leads them into immorality, and it leads them in all sorts of different directions. People that live in the same place, they take the knowledge of God they have and they sinfully suppress it and reject it and refuse to listen to the truth, and they end up believing completely different things than you and I believe. That's the biblical answer. If you wanted to know what's the philosophical answer, we would say people have different worldviews. Now, I'll just be very blunt with you. I loved seminary. I loved Greek class. I even found a particular joy in Hebrew class. I like the Old Testament stuff, the New Testament stuff, the systematic theology stuff. I don't like philosophy classes. I had to take a basic philosophy class and I had to take an extra philosophy class. It was epistemology. We're going to talk about epistemology tonight. It was the hardest class I took at seminary. I spent half the time saying, I have no idea what these guys are talking about. Absolutely no clue what they're talking about. So philosophy is one of those things that for me, I hear it and I think, I don't really get into that. But that's really what we're talking about when we talk about worldview. How is it that so many different people live in the same place at the same time, have the same experiences, and they interpret all of it completely differently? The answer to that is worldview. So, what is a worldview? You can think about it like a pair of glasses. And I don't know if you noticed the cover of the Sire book, but on the cover of the Sire book, on the new edition, the word door is a pair of glasses, right? And they're saying to you, worldview is like a pair of glasses. It's like a pair of glasses with a particular tint or a particular shade, and when you put those glasses on, it colors and it changes everything that you see through those glasses. That's what your worldview is. It's a pair of spectacles that you put on, and it makes some things sharper, some things blurrier, some things brighter, some things duller. It affects the way you see life, the way you literally, to coin a phrase, view the world. You can also think about it, if you don't like the glasses analogy, you can think about it like an operating system on a computer. Okay? I can take my Apple phone and I can type an email on this phone and I can send it to you on a PC, computer, desktop computer. And the same information is going to be carried through that transmission, but it's going to look different on my phone than it does on your computer. And you say, well, what's the difference? It's the same basic facts. It's the same basic information. Why did the font change and the format change and the display change and the size change? Well, part of the answer to that is operating system. Those two devices are running off different operating systems. The evangelical in the United States, the Muslim in Afghanistan, the witch doctor in Brazil, the atheist in Germany, who did I leave out? The statue worshiper in India. They're all running different operating systems. They're all looking at the world through different glasses. That's what worldview is. So, to start off, I've given you 6 definitions of worldview. I want to read them. I'm trying not to just read things to you in these classes, but I just want to read through these. 3 of them come from a guy named Ron Nash. He's a great Christian philosopher. And then I got Walters, David Wells, and then James Sire. So what is a worldview? Here's some definitions. A worldview is a set of beliefs about the most important issues in life. Instead of thinking of Christianity as a collection of theological bits and pieces to be believed and debated, and by the way, that's how most Christians in the United States think about Christianity. It's a set of doctrinal, theological bits and pieces to be argued, debated, picked over, left out. I want this one, I don't want that one. That's how Americans do theology. It's like we're in a cafeteria line at Furr's. And we go through and we say, I'll have the mac and cheese. In fact, I think I'll have 2 mac and cheese, and I will pass on the Jell-O salad. I don't want any of that. And we go through the line and we end up with exactly what we want. That's what Americans do with theology. We think that we're the authority and we can just pick and choose and combine what we want. These theological bits and pieces we put together. Nash says instead, we should approach our faith as a conceptual system, as a total world and life view. Meaning, you don't get to just pick and choose what you like and don't like, what you want and don't want. You get all of it or nothing. You get the whole package or you lose, you compromise the entire thing. Nash says this in a different book. Whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not, each of us has a worldview. These worldviews function as interpretive conceptual schemes to explain why we, quote, see the world as we do. Why we often think and act the way that we do. So what he's saying here is there's some explanative power, right? He's going to be able to explain why you do this or why you do that or why you see it this way or why you think about it that way based on your worldview. One more quote from Nash. A worldview contains a person's answers to the most or to the major questions in life, almost all of which contain significant philosophical content. It's a conceptual framework, pattern, or arrangement of a person's beliefs. The best worldviews are comprehensive, systematic, supposedly true views of the life and the world. Now, Albert Walters, here's another take. For our purposes, worldview will be defined as a comprehensive framework of one's basic belief about things. Okay? Comprehensive framework. A worldview, even when it's half unconscious and unarticulated, functions like a compass or a road map. It orients us in the world at large. It gives us a sense of what's up and down, what's right and wrong, and the confusion of events and phenomena that confronts us. This one comes from David Wells, great theologian. Everyone has a view of the world from their own place in it. This view compromises an understanding of what is ultimate, if anything is, how this might be discovered, whether there is such a thing as truth, how that truth might be found, what is the meaning of life, what is the explanation of what has gone wrong, and what are the end outcomes to life. The answers to these questions form a view of the world that can be called a worldview, however inconsistent and confused it might be. And if you read Wells and you read many other people, they'll make the point that most Americans do, in fact, have a very inconsistent and a very confused worldview, where they've tried to go through the cafeteria line and take and choose and pick. And if you actually look at it, it doesn't hold together in any coherent, reasonable fashion at all. So, James Sire, a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story, or in a set of propositions or presuppositions, which we hold about the basic constitution of reality and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. So let's summarize those definitions. I know that's a lot. Let's summarize those definitions with some basics about worldview. Number one, worldviews, there's three options. They may be entirely true. And I would argue that the Christian worldview is entirely true. Every piece of that worldview is true. It corresponds to reality and it all holds together. We also should admit that worldviews can be partially true. And you've got to have the intellectual integrity, most people don't have this in our context today, to say worldviews can be entirely false. So, partially true. I put Islam up there. That might make you uneasy on some level. But if I said to you, the Islamic worldview teaches that there's one God, I don't disagree with that. The Islamic worldview teaches that there is a very clearly revealed morality about what is right and what is wrong. And truth be told, it's a lot closer to our view of morality or ethics than a lot of the non-Christian secular worldviews that you'll bump into on a common university campus. So there's a very clear morality there. They believe that the one true God has spoken to people through prophets and revealed himself to mankind. All of those things I would say to you, and you would say, well, I believe those things. If you are a Christian and you have a Christian worldview, you would agree with those things. But there's other things we could say about the Islamic worldview, the Muslim worldview. Sire lays it out very clearly, where we would say, but those parts aren't true. Some of those things are true. Some of those things they are seeing correctly, but some of those pieces, worldview pieces, are not quite right. And then you can get into something like Buddhism or Hinduism. In Sire's book, he just calls it Eastern pantheistic monism. And you start reading that chapter, it's why I didn't actually assign it to you, but some of you are now curious and you're going to go read it. And you're going to get 3 paragraphs into it and you're going to say, I don't know what that means. I don't either. It's complete craziness. It really has absolutely nothing in common with the Christian worldview. I mean, you set them side by side and you just come away saying these are 2 entirely different ways of looking at the world. And if you're going to posit that the Christian worldview is entirely true, by definition, that worldview that is entirely different has to be entirely false. So that's where we'll start. Let's add this. Worldviews may be held consciously or unconsciously. So some people are very much aware of what their worldview is, the things that they believe and why they believe them, and they can articulate all the things that we're going to talk about tonight as far as worldview pieces. Most people can't. Most people have no idea that they have a worldview. Most people are like the fish in the water that doesn't realize he's wet, or the human being walking around that doesn't even realize they're breathing. It's just sort of a default operating system that is working behind the scenes in their brain or in their heart. And it's coloring and it's affecting everything that they see and think and feel and do and all the rest of it. But it's not even something that they're aware of on any level. Worldviews may be consistent or inconsistent. I would argue that the Christian worldview is consistent, meaning it has integrity, literally meaning it all holds together. It's like a puzzle that has all the pieces and they all fit together, and you don't get down to that last piece and say, where's that last puzzle piece? They didn't put it in the box. That's what everybody says. They didn't put that piece in the box. No, it's on the floor under the rug, or somebody stole it or whatever. Other worldviews are not consistent at all. It's literally like you took half the pieces from one puzzle with half the pieces from another puzzle and you put them in one box and you said, there, put them all together. And you can put some things together, but eventually you're going to run up to something you say, that just doesn't fit. It doesn't belong there. So worldviews, they can be consistent or they can be inconsistent. We're going to come back to that idea. Last, fourthly, everyone has a worldview, whether they realize it or not. Everyone. Many people in our culture do not realize they have a worldview, and many do not live according to their worldview. And I thought about that statement today. Part of me wanted to scratch it and change the way that that's written, but I think it makes the point. You could look at that last phrase, many people do not live according to their worldview, and you could say, actually, everyone lives according to their worldview. That would be a accurate way of looking at it. What you might say is that people don't live according to the worldview that they think that they have. People are inconsistent when they think about, this is how I view the world and this is how I'm going to live my life. Many times those things don't line up at all. So you really could look at that and say, no, that's completely wrong. Actually, people always live out their worldview, and the way that people live is actually the tell that shows you what their worldview really is. You could think about that a couple different ways. So let's talk about worldview categories. I quoted Ron Nash earlier. I think Ron Nash's stuff is great on worldview. He breaks it down into 5 categories, but we're reading Sire, and I really like his breakdown better. He gives you 8 basic worldview categories. So for those of you who have read, this is familiar to you. Those of you who are going to read, you're going to come back and say, well, he lifted that right out of the book. And I'm telling you right now, I lifted this right out of the book. This is not my stuff. This is Sire's stuff. And it's really, really solid stuff. It's really helpful. So we're going to go through these 8 questions, and we're just going to talk about each of them briefly. Question number 1. This is an important piece of a worldview. What is prime reality? And I know that that phrasing is weird. You have never heard me stand on this platform in a Sunday morning prayer and address the great prime reality up in the heavens, nor will you ever hear me. But he's saying, he's not just talking about categories for a Christian worldview, he's talking about categories for all worldviews. So you got to broaden this out a little bit. You got to get the crazy uncle Eastern pantheistic monism in here. And you got to say the first most basic worldview question is, what is ultimate or prime reality? Now, a lot of you are thinking, well, Christian worldview, that answer is easy. The answer is God. That's right. It's the right answer. But it's not all of the right answer, because the Muslim would agree with you there. And if you really dig deep on this worldview question, we don't agree with a Muslim about that particular God. And it's intellectually dishonest. This is all I can say. It's completely intellectually dishonest when people paper over those differences and gloss over it and say we all just worship the same God. It's just like saying Ron and Corey are wearing the same color of shirt. Corey's glowing green and Ron's got like red, salmon-y, something. It's not the same. And if I looked at you in the eyeball and said that's the same color, you would say you're either colorblind or you're crazy or you're a liar. But they're not the same. You got to have the honesty to say they're not the same. So what is the true Christian answer? We would say, what is prime reality? We would say the triune God is ultimate prime reality. He's what comes before everything else. There is one true God. He exists as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He's one in essence, and he's 3 in person. In the early years of the New Testament church, they had to have a lot of discussions to sort this out and to study the scriptures together. As the New Testament is being written and passed around and sometimes read for the very first time, they had to sort this out, this worldview question. What is prime reality? The animist, your witch doctor in Brazil, would completely disagree with that. And he would say to you, the spirit realm is the prime reality, the ultimate reality. That's what's really real. And there's a whole bunch that goes with that, but that would be the animist answer. Our materialist, teaching at a university in Germany, would say prime reality is the dirt underneath your feet. Matter. Stuff. That's it. That is the ultimate, and you have just somehow or another come from that, and all of it can be reduced to just dirt, carbon atoms, protein molecules, however you want to break it down. That would be their answer. The Hindu, if you get into the chapter on Eastern pantheistic monism, would say it's Atman and Brahman, the individual soul being united with the cosmic soul, and already you're like, that is the weirdest thing I've ever, it's weird, but that's the answer. You're part of the ultimate reality in that worldview. You're part of it. That's why somebody like Shirley MacLaine can go on national television back in the day and say, I'm God. And Christians everywhere lost their mind saying, clearly you're not. you're Shirley, and you act in movies. But in her worldview, she's connected to the prime reality. Postmodernism is one of the chapters in this book. He's got a great chapter on postmodernism. Postmodernism would say probably a lot of different things, but one common answer from the postmodernist would be, what is prime reality? The game that we play with language to try to control each other. We just box people into verbal corners with words, and it's all a power play for me to control you or you to control me, and we just play this back and forth game. That's ultimate reality. So you've got to answer that question, what is prime reality? Question 2, what is the nature of external reality? That is the world around us. How do you explain the church parking lot in the Permian Basin, in the state of Texas, and the continent that we live on, and the world that we live on, and the solar system that we're part of, and the galaxy that we're part of, and the universe that we're in? How do you explain all that stuff out there? Was it created, or is it eternal? Your answer to that question is going to have massive impact on the direction your worldview takes. Is it created, or is it eternal? Is there order to it, or is it complete chaos? People disagree. Some people look at it and say, no, it's orderly, it's predictable, we can study it, we can learn what's going to happen, we can understand it. And other people say, no, it's completely chaotic and crazy. Is it only physical out there? Or is there something spiritual out there external that's real? I think a lot of Christians would say there's something spiritual out there that's real, and then we would probably live our everyday, day-to-day lives if it's only physical. We tend to neglect that spiritual realm as Christians, at least in the West. And we say, yes, there's spiritual things, angels and spiritual beings and heaven and hell. There are these places out there external. But really, we live our lives as if the physical is all that exists. This is crazy, but under this worldview question, you would put stuff like the simulation hypothesis, like the Matrix movies. You live in a computer simulation. Prove to me you don't. You're programmed into it. You don't know any better. You're just a figment of some brain in a test tube lab being poked and prodded and stimulated. How do you know that you're not the figment of somebody's imagination? How would you not know any different? What's the nature of external reality? Question 3, what is a human being? And I told you Sunday that you live in the age of anthropological heresy. This is the worldview question that has gone completely haywire in the West in the 21st century. What is a human being? Are we animals? Are we machines? Are we economic units and producers? Are we sexual beings? That was Freud's answer to this worldview question. What is a human being? It's an organism, living organism, created to have sex. That's the worldview answer that he would posit there. Are we divine? Are we part of the divine? Can we connect to the divine? Do we get to decide who we are, or does somebody else decide who we are? What is gender? What is sexuality? What is marriage? What's the relationship between parents and children? What's the nature of the relationship between men and women in a home or in a church? All those are questions that boil down to this worldview issue. What is a human being? The Christian worldview would say a couple of things. We're created by God. We're creatures. We're not ultimate. We belong down in question 3, not up in question 1. Okay, we're creatures. We're created in God's image, meaning we're created unique amongst everything else that exists, different, and for a special purpose, and that purpose is to know God and to glorify God. And if you stop there, you haven't gone nearly far enough. What is a human being? Somebody who is sinful and born separated from God because of their sin. That has to be part of the Christian answer for what is a human being. You have to include that category of sin. And a lot of worldviews don't. A lot of worldviews would say, no. whatever you are as a human being, you're not sinful, you're not fallen, you're not broken in any sense. You are exactly the way that you ought to be. So you got to answer this question. Question 4, what happens to a person at death? What happens when you die? The naturalist in Germany says you came from the dirt and you're going back to the dirt and you're going to be worm food. That's what happens to you after you die. You're gone. The chemical synapses firing in your brain stop. Somebody pulls the plug is pulled, and then that's it. There's no more of you. Your physical body may be here, but when it decomposes, that's it. You're completely gone, and that's what happens when you die. The Hindu, what does the Hindu say? Well, you die, then you're born again, and your position when you're born again is based on how you lived in the previous incarnation. You're going to be reincarnated, and eventually you're trying to work yourself to complete unity through this process of death and life and rebirth and reincarnation, trying to work your way towards unity with what is ultimate reality. The Hindu says ultimately you are like a drop being subsumed by the ocean. And the Buddhist has an interesting twist on that. The Buddhist thinks that ultimate reality is nothing. And that what happens when you die is you're like a candle that gets snuffed out. You don't even get to be part of the ocean, you just gone. And that's the goal. What happens when you die? The Muslim says you're going to be judged, which we would say, well, we believe that. The Bible talks about that. Man is destined to die once and then to face judgment. But we understand that left to ourselves, because we've talked about this on What is a Human Being, we're in big trouble at the judgment, and our only hope is Jesus Christ and the grace of God. And the Muslim would say, no, it's all on you. It's going to be weighed out in a scale. That's what happens when you die. Question 5, this is a huge one, a huge one. Why is it possible to know anything at all? How is it possible to have knowledge? This is the study of epistemology. How do you know? How do you learn? The biblical answer would be, well, we're created in God's image. We're created as rational thinking creatures. We have a brain. There's clearly a difference in the way that human brains work and other animals' brains work. We create things. We create culture. We create society. We create laws. We change those laws, explore, all sorts of stuff. So we have brains, but we would also say as Christians, we can know some things because God has revealed them to us. He's revealed himself in creation. He's revealed himself in history when he saved a people from slavery in Egypt in dramatic fashion. He's revealed himself in the scriptures. God speaks to us. He has spoken to us, and that's how we can know things. What would our scientist in Germany say? How can you know things? Well, they would say, well, it has to be scientific. All that exists is what's here. So you got to be able to prove it and recreate it in a lab. But then those sneaky naturalists, they don't play by their own rules. Because they say to you on this level of worldview, the only things that you can know are things that you can prove and verify and test and recreate in a lab, double-blind studies, all the rest. And then you say to them, tell me about origins, the very beginning of life. They can't recreate it, can't test it, nobody recorded it, they don't have a spreadsheet with the facts in it, but they say to you, oh, we have a scientific explanation for that. There's nothing scientific about it. There's no testing of it. There's no verification of it. There's no proof of it. It's all a worldview assumption that they start with. But they're scientists and they label it scientific, and the world has just completely bought the idea that it's scientific. So how do you know anything at all? This is a big one. There's debates right now in our culture about race and gender and sexuality. And we'll get to this in a couple of weeks when we talk about critical theory. But the dominant view in the academy today in the United States of America says the way that you know things is not through math, science, chemistry, hard sciences. It's not even through observational sociological data. The dominant view on the rise is that you know things through people's stories and their lived experiences. It doesn't matter what you can verify, what you can prove, what you can quantify, what you can rationally explain. You cannot have any higher source of knowledge than whatever Charlie Beck tells you is true in his experience and how he's lived and the things that have happened to him. That's the ultimate standard for truth. And that's in the academy in the United States, in the West. Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia. That's the dominant view of epistemology. Whatever your lived experience is, no one can argue with that. You don't have to have letters behind your name. You don't have to have a rational study of any kind. You don't have to have a rational argument of any kind. You don't have to have propositional truth of any variety. You just have to say, this is my lived experience, and that's how you know things. It's very dangerous, very dangerous. Next question, how do we know what's right and wrong? So this is ethics. How do we know what's right and wrong? Obviously, Americans have strong disagreements about that, and obviously we have disagreements with people around the world about that. It's a worldview difference. Next question, what's the meaning of history? The Hindu says it's circular, reincarnation and rebirth and hopefully enlightenment someday. The Christian says it's not like that. The Christian says there was a beginning, then there was a fall, and then there was a process of redemption, and then there's going to be an end. It's a beginning and an end. It's not a circle, it's linear. It's moving from this point to that point. Christ is going to return, and that's going to change our experience of history. Part of this question of what is the meaning of history is you have to explain evil and suffering in the world. That's an important worldview category. How do you make sense of evil and suffering? And I'll be real honest with you. Christians get lambasted all the time on this worldview issue. If, worldview question 1, ultimate reality is a good God, and he's almighty and all-powerful and all-knowing, why, worldview question number 7, is there so much history in the world, both now and throughout history? And Christians get backed into this corner and we get defensive and we get scared because that's a hard question. Let's be honest, that's a hard question. There's not a lot of easy answers to that. But I'm just telling you, if you listen to other worldviews, give an answer for that, you'll roll your eyes or you'll laugh or you'll just be shocked to say that's the worst answer I've ever heard. What is the naturalist going to say on this question of what's the meaning of human history and how do you explain all the suffering? What would the committed naturalist say? They would say, in the beginning there was matter, the whole thing blew up, and since then it's all just been chemical reaction after chemical reaction. It's all predetermined. You can predict it just like you can predict the flow of atoms in the periodic table. Obviously, it's very complicated. The world and the universe is a big place, so it's hard for us to predict it, but it all just boils down to chemical reactions. Does anybody feel like that's an intellectually, morally satisfying answer for the Holocaust? What are you so uptight about? It's just chemical reaction. It was inevitable. That's the answer of the naturalist. Their answer is not any better than our answer. So we'll talk about the confidence we ought to have in our worldview here in a minute. One last question. What personal life-orienting core commitments are consistent with this worldview? Meaning, how should your life change if these things are true? If the naturalist is right, they should never talk about falling in love. They should just talk about chemical reactions in their brain and dopamine being released because there was some sort of visual stimulus or whatever. It's just chemical reactions. It's just matter. There's nothing else out there. There's nothing ultimate. How does it change the way that you live? How does it impact the core commitments that you ought to make? Here's another way of thinking about this. I think this is really helpful, and many times I've come back to this as we've gone on mission trips, as I've shared the gospel with people here in the United States, as I've talked to my own family members who are unbelievers. I've come back to this idea, and it's layers of worldview, okay? And we'll lay it out like this. Worldview tells us what is real. Beliefs tell us what is true. Values, pardon the typo, tell us what is good. And behavior tells us what we do. what is real, what is true, what is good, and what we do. And then I've given you this little graphic to show you. Our behavior is the most outward, external thing about us. Okay? Think about this like an onion of a person. You peel back one layer, and you've got values. If you peel back another layer, you've got beliefs. And if you pull back another layer, you've got worldview. So let me give you an explanation of how this works in real life. William Carey is the father of modern missions. He left Britain on a boat to take the gospel to India. And people laughed at him and said it was stupid, and people weren't taking mission trips at that point in history. They weren't sending missionaries, but he said, I'm going to take the gospel to these people. So he goes to India, and he encounters people who have a very different worldview than him. And it's just shocking. I mean, there's no point of reference. It's completely different. And one of the things that he sees, doesn't take him long, when he's there in India, is he sees the practice of sati. Sati is an Indian practice. It's not practiced a lot anymore, but it was really common in Carey's day. It's the practice of taking a widow when her husband dies and burning her alive on her husband's funeral pyre. So the husband dies, and they have a funeral, and they lay him out on a bonfire, and they take the woman and they throw her, kicking and screaming and objecting, you can imagine, on the fire. And everyone sits around and says, now that was a nice funeral service. That was really good. Really touched my heart right there. And William Carey looks at that and he's like, what in the world is the matter with you people? Okay, he's looking at the behavior. And the behavior makes absolutely no sense, right? For a guy from England, he's like, this is absolute crazy talk. You start peeling it back and you say, why would they do this? It's because the Indians value people living their lot in life. That's why they have a caste system. This is your lot in life. This is where you belong. We're not going to move you down, but we're certainly not going to move you up. You belong right here. And you should live they would call it dharma, right here. Just stay in this lane, whether you're rich, poor, healthy, sick, whatever, you stay in this lane. And for a widow, for a woman, her dharma is bound to her husband. So when he croaks, she's got to go. So we're throwing her on top. You say, well, why do they value that? Why do they value living your lot in life? It's because they believe that karma is a real thing. And for Indians, for Hindus, karma is not like Corey driving down the road and he cuts somebody off. So 1 block later, he gets a flat tire and you're like, karma, gotcha. That's not how it works for them. For the Hindu, your karma is tied to your dharma. Live your life, stay in your lane in this life, and then in your next life, when you're reincarnated, you'll bump up one notch, one level. That's how karma works. It's not an instant sort of silly thing like Americans have turned it into, but it's an ultimate thing connected to reincarnation. So you need to stay in your lane, and in the next life, you bump up. Widows, we're going to help you stay in your lane, and we're going to throw you on the funeral pyre of your husband. Why would they do that? Why would they believe in the dharma stuff, stay in your lane, and the karma stuff and the reincarnation stuff? It's a worldview issue. It's worldview question number 4. What happens when you die? Reincarnation. It's a worldview issue at the core. So if you're William Carey and you walk in and you say, they are throwing women on the funeral pyres of their husband, what do? He did 2 things. He worked tirelessly to pass legislation that would change the behavior. He said, that's wrong. That behavior's wrong. I don't care why you're doing it. I don't care how you can explain it. That's wrong. We're not going to throw women on the funeral pyres of their husbands. We're going to change the behavior. But Carey understood we can pass a law and change the behavior, and we're not going to change anything internally. That's an important thing for Americans to understand in the United States of America, because we tend to operate, especially we in the Bible Belt, we tend to operate with the assumption of if we could just get this party in power and get rid of that law and pass this law, everything will be great. There's a place for getting this party in and that party out and passing this law. There's a place for that. But it's not going to change anybody on a worldview level. Okay? You can look at this with a lot of different things. I'll try to go through this one quickly. In Islam, there's a practice called zakat. It's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Okay? 5 things you do as a Muslim that gives you a really good shot at eternal life when everything's weighed out. So one of them is zakat, and it just means giving alms to the poor. Muslims give alms to the poor. Truth be told, they probably give more than Christians give. They give a lot of money to the poor. And you look at that and you say, well, that's nice. We give to the poor. It looks like we're just the same as Muslims. When you start pulling back the worldview layers, you realize, why do they do that? It's because they value generosity. Why do they value generosity? It's because they believe that they have the ability to work their way into some eternal reward. Well, why in the world do they believe that? Well, it's a worldview issue. At its core, it's a worldview issue and what they believe about God and what they believe about what happens when you die. And it all boils down to that worldview issue. And Christians, we give generously, right? Let's be honest. Some Christians give because they think just like Muslims. They think, I'm giving because it's going to give me a good shot in the afterlife. When Christians do that, they're not operating out of a Christian worldview. They're basically borrowing from a Muslim worldview, if you want to think about it that way. But ideally, Christians give because we value generosity. Why? It's because we believe that God, the prime reality in the universe, is both good and generous, and that He owns everything, and that the stuff that we have really isn't ours. It's stuff that He gave us. And at the core of our worldview, we say, God has been generous to us in His Son, Jesus Christ, and we want to be generous in giving back. We don't trust this stuff. Money's not prime reality. God's prime reality. So we give. It's the same outward behavior, but when you dial it down to a worldview level, it's not the same behavior. It's completely different. In the United States, you and I could list out any number of behaviors that we don't like. I mean, we could just make a list, and it would not be hard. I could say, tell me things you see people doing in the United States of America that you think are wrong, immoral, unbiblical, and we could fill the pages up, right? Our approach to that has to be a bit like William Carey. Some of that stuff on that list, we should work through a political process to change laws that will constrain behavior. Paul talks about that in Romans. That's one of the functions of governments, to restrain evil. The government bears the sword for that purpose. But we also know, just because you get your favorite politician in power and get your favorite law passed, it's not going to change anyone on a worldview level. If the Supreme Court decided tomorrow abortion is illegal in the United States of America, and they flipped Roe v. Wade, flipping Roe v. Wade wouldn't make it illegal, but let's just imagine they flipped it and they said, it's now illegal, you can't perform an abortion in the United States of America. You might change some outward behavior, and Christians, I think, would be glad for it to change. No one would change on a worldview level because a law was passed. That's not how worldviews change. And this can have really, really bad consequences. I'll tell you one more story. I went on a mission trip to Argentina. And the missionary there took us, we were in Cordoba, Argentina, which is kind of like a highfalutin intellectual university town. And he took us to this old cathedral built in Argentina by the Spaniards. And they took us on this tour. And at one point we walked, you see that staircase on the right? We kind of walked above that to the side, and we could look over these clay tiles. And on those clay tiles, there were fingerprints of the indigenous people who built the cathedral. It was a really amazing thing to see. You could, the clay tiles from the original construction, and you could see the fingerprints of the men who built it. They were not Spaniard fingerprints. They were indigenous people fingerprints. Because the Spaniards showed up in South America and this part of Argentina, and with a sword, they gathered up these indigenous people and said, you are now Catholic. And the sword was right in their face. And they said, okay, we're Catholic. And some external things changed. Some behaviors changed. They started showing up to Mass on Sunday because the Spaniards told them you're supposed to show up to Mass on Sunday. And they started building cathedrals for the Spaniards because that sword was still in their face. And the Spaniards said, we're going to build a cathedral and you're going to help us do it. So they built this cathedral. It's very Catholic. Mary's there. Weird statues of Jesus are there. Weird for Protestants, not weird for Catholics, but weird for us. And there's altars and there's candles and there's paintings of the saints. I mean, there's all the stuff. It's a cathedral. If you've been in one, you've been in all of them on some level. They kind of all look the same. It's beautiful. Beautiful. So we're in there, and the guy touring us around, he takes us right up to the middle, right up in front of the altar in the sanctuary. It's empty. There's no services going on, and he tells us to look up. And we look right up, and this dome sort of thing up at the top, he says, what do you see up at the top? And right up at the top, at the very high point of the cathedral, above Jesus, above Mary, above the saints, above all that stuff, they had painted a sun on the ceiling. Their worldview didn't change. Before the Spaniards showed up, they worshiped the sun. And the Spaniards changed a lot of external behavior. You're going to go to Mass. When you stand up at this point of the Mass, kneel down at this point, this is what you say. You're going to build a cathedral. You're not going to offer the sacrifices to this thing, but you can come pray to the saints. They changed a lot of external stuff. But swords don't change worldviews. It's not how it works. And it didn't change the worldviews of these indigenous people. And they built this thing with the sword in their face. And then when the Spaniards weren't looking, they painted a sun at the top and said, well, just let's be real clear. We're still worshiping the sun. You can change all the external trappings of it, but nothing changed at the core. And that's why I like this little picture. This got these worldview layers. At the core is our worldview. So let's transition. Let's talk about the importance of worldview. I just want to go through a few things with you, thoughts, ideas about why worldviews are important. We're going to look up some scriptures as we go through these, so you may want to have a copy of the Bible handy. Number one, we must understand the biblical worldview. We're Christian people. We believe in the triune God. We believe that he's spoken to his people in the scriptures. Part of the call on our life is to understand not just bits and pieces of theology. It's not just to do the right things externally, but is to actually understand and hold to a Christian worldview. So Peter says, 1 Peter 3:15, in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect. The expectation from Peter to Christians is that if somebody backs you into a corner and wants to know about the hope you have as a Christian, you can give some sort of reasonable defense of that. You don't have to be able to answer every question. You don't have to be able to understand every worldview, but you've got to understand your worldview. Why is it, do you think, you've read the statistics, why is it, do you think, that so many young people get drugged to church all through the nursery, go to Sunday school all through grade school, go through high school, and they have to go to every youth camp, and then they go off to college and they completely walk away from all of that stuff? Why does that happen, okay? The biblical answer would be sin, to go back to the beginning. The philosophical answer would be there are worldview issues going on with many, not all, but many of those young people. And through the years, they have been taught Christian behavior. They know how Christians ought to behave. And they have been taught Christian values, things that Christians think are important. And they have even been taught Christian beliefs, the bits and pieces of theology. When you ask the question in Sunday school, they know the answer is probably Jesus, God, or the Bible. They got all the little bits and pieces in place. But at the core of who they are, they don't have a biblical Christian worldview. They actually, truth be told, have a Disney worldview or a YouTube worldview or whatever it may be, or just a completely mashed up, conflicted worldview. And they go off and some two-bit professor throws some stupid syllogism at them that they don't know how to answer or respond to, and it sends their whole life into this tailspin of, I don't know what I thought I knew. Well, they knew the behavior. They could tell you what the Christian values are. They could even tell you some of the beliefs, but at the core, they didn't understand these worldview issues, and they're completely shaken by it. I think this happens even within churches. People don't really operate with a Christian worldview. I think sometimes Christians in the Bible Belt operate, what is a human being? What is that question for? What is a human being? The Bible would say all human beings are image bearers. And I really believe, I'm not trying to get like annoyingly political, but I really believe some Christians in the Bible Belt believe that the answer to question 4 is, what is a human being? Well, those who are born in the United States and have a United States passport are image bearers. That there's a level of who's a real person and who's somebody that we don't care about quite as much. Now, I'm a proud American, and I'm for a lot of things that people would think is backwards and mean and primitive and all that kind of stuff, but just because you were born on that side of the border doesn't make you any less of an image bearer than somebody born on this side of the border. That's not a biblical worldview, but people operate that way, and they live that way, and they make decisions, and they vote that way many times. Within the church, people come to churches many times, and they live without this piece of what is a human being. They live without an understanding that human beings are sinful people. And they come to church and they get hurt and they're just shocked and mortified. I can't believe I got hurt by someone at the church. Why? Do you have a biblical worldview? Because everyone who sits in these seats on Sunday morning is a fallen, wretched sinner. Hopefully, prayerfully, we would say we want them to be a sinner saved by the grace of God, brought into a relationship with God. But we're all sinful people. It's inevitable that people are going to get hurt. Why would you come into a church expecting never to get hurt? Why would you quit going to a church just because you got hurt there? If you claim to be a Christian, why would you walk away from it? It's because you don't have a really biblical worldview. You've got to live with a biblical understanding, with a biblical worldview. Okay, next, importance of worldview. We must place God at the center of our worldview. God has to be at the center. And we've talked about this on Sundays. What a lot of people do in the United States is they end up segregating life. And they sort of operate on a Sunday morning with one worldview. And then they go to regular life, normal life, work, school, home, sports, whatever. And they operate with a different worldview. And it's like they walk through those double doors and they walk in here and it's like they flip a switch. Okay, this is church. Got to act a certain way. Certain things are important. This is what we believe. This is who I am. Then they walk out that door and it's like the switch is flipped. And they operate with a completely different worldview. As Christians, you and I have got to make sure that God is at the center of our worldview. That's what Isaiah is saying to God's people in Isaiah 40. All this stuff in the Old Testament about idolatry and faithlessness and they're chasing after this God and this goddess, it's all worldview stuff. It's worldview question number 1. And the people of Israel constantly get question 1 wrong on a worldview level. Is Yahweh the God of Israel the prime reality, or is it Baal, Elijah? Pick. Pick your answer. Is it going to be Yahweh or is it going to be Baal? That's the most basic question that you have got to deal with. And Isaiah is laying it out for the people. He's just giving them this obvious reminders. Isaiah 40:12. Who measured the waters in the hollow of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span and closed the dust of the earth with a measure and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in the balance? Whoever that guy is, that's prime reality. That's the guy that's got to be at the center of your worldview. Verse 15. The nations, they're like a drop from a bucket. They are accounted as the dust of the scales. He takes up the coastlands like fine dust. Verse 18, to whom then will you liken God, or what likeness compare with him? There's not anybody like him. He's completely unique. He's absolutely holy. He has got to be at the center of your worldview. Verse 21, do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It's he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers. stretches out the heavens like a curtain, spreads them like a tent to dwell in. He brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. Verse 25, to whom will you compare me that I should be like him? Says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these, who brings out their hosts by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, because he is strong in power, not one is missing. The whole chapter is that kind of stuff. It's Isaiah saying you have got to have a true picture, a true understanding of who God is, and he's got to be at the center of your worldview. Otherwise, it all goes haywire. It all goes haywire. You got to get that question right. Thirdly, we got to be able to interact with other worldviews. And I would point you to Acts 17. Acts 17. Paul's on a mission trip. He didn't really plan it this way, but he ends up in Athens. He's been in Philippi. He's been in Thessalonica. He stops in Berea. And then he ends up in Athens. And there are not a lot of Christian people in Athens. And there's also not a lot of Jewish people in Athens. And so Paul gets an opportunity to stand up and talk to these people in Athens. They don't know the Old Testament. They've never read Genesis. They don't know any of that stuff. And Paul does not stand up and say, please open your Old Testaments to Exodus chapter 20. He does that kind of stuff when he goes to the synagogue with Jews. He engages them on a worldview level. But when he stands up and he preaches in Athens, that's not how he approaches it at all. Acts 17, verse 16, Paul's waiting. His spirit is provoked within him. He saw the city was full of idols. So he did reason in the synagogue with the Jews and the devout persons in the marketplace. But then, verse 18, the Epicurean and Stoic philosophers start talking to him, and they end up inviting him to talk about his beliefs at the Areopagus. So you jump down to verse 22. He stands up. He says, men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you are very religious. I even saw, passed along, observed the objects of your worship. There was an altar to the unknown God. What you therefore worship is unknown. This I proclaim to you. That's worldview talk. Paul says, look, I've been walking around your city. I see what you worship. Idols. You even have one you don't even know the name of. Right? He understands what they believe on a worldview level, and he picks up on that, and that's his intro. His intro is not, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. Now, he gets to that, but he doesn't quote it directly. He's talking with them on a worldview level, and this is the value of reading a book like Sire's book. You're going to meet people in everyday life. They don't look at the world the way that you look at it. And you can sit there and argue at each other and butt heads with each other and talk past each other, and you can miss the foundational issues that separate you. Christians do this with Mormons all the time. You understand a Mormon has a completely different worldview than you do. It's not the same worldview. And Christians love to argue with Mormons about temple underwear. Who cares? That's like item 5,231 on the list that you need to talk about. How about let's talk about some foundational worldview issues. How do you know what you know? You believe Joseph Smith was a prophet. I believe he was a lying, plagiarizing pervert. That's a worldview issue at the most basic level. Don't worry about the crazy stuff out there. Let's talk on a basic worldview level and have an actual conversation. Now, your Mormon missionary doesn't want to talk about that stuff. They want to say, oh, we're really the same. There's really no difference. You love Jesus, we love Jesus. Jesus is in the name of our church. We're all about Jesus. It's a completely different view of who God is. Question one is a completely different answer. You got to be able to interact with people's worldviews. And you got to poke holes in people's worldviews. That's what Paul's doing in Athens. He's not trying to flatter them when he says, you have an altar to an unknown God. He's very politely saying, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. You actually have an altar to a God, and you don't know his name. I'm going to tell you his name. He's not patting them on the back. He's saying, this is really crazy, and you know it, and I know it. So you got to be able to interact with other worldviews. Next, we got to be confident in the superiority of our worldview, the biblical worldview. Psalm 119, the psalmist prays, the longest chapter in the Bible. Psalm 119, 68 says, "You are good and do good. Teach me your statutes." We want God to teach us his word. Why? Because he's good and he does good. We believe that we're getting truth, worldview truth, from a God who is good and who does good. We believe we have the best worldview out there. You've got to be convinced of that. Nancy Pearcey has a great book on worldview, and she says this: the best way to drive out a bad worldview is by offering a good one. You know what a lot of Christians are doing in 2021 is apologizing for our worldview, is being embarrassed about what the Bible says. Does the Bible actually say this about homosexuality? Well, we don't talk about that a lot at my church. We don't need to go there. Does the Bible really say, do you really believe that Jesus is the only way to go to heaven? Well, the preacher says that, but it seems kind of mean. I have a cousin who goes to a different kind of church and, whatever. And we get defensive and we get embarrassed about our worldview. Instead, you just need to stand up straight and say, yes, that's what I believe. And it comes from God. And he is good and he does good. And he knows what's best because he's the creator. And so I'm not embarrassed that the Bible says this about morality or truth or life after death or whatever. The nature of life in this world, external reality. Yes, this is what the Bible says. It's not up for debate. I'm not embarrassed about it. I'm not going to apologize for it. You don't have to be a jerk as you present it to people, but you don't have to be embarrassed about it, and you certainly don't have to apologize for it. Be confident in the superiority of our worldview. Next, resist the urge to adopt popular worldviews. Look what Moses said to the people right at the end of his life, Deuteronomy 30, verse 17 and 18. If your heart turns away and you will not hear, but you are drawn away to worship other gods and serve them, meaning you get worldview question number 1 wrong and all the other questions fall like dominoes. If you do that, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are going over the Jordan to enter and possess. Moses is warning the people, do not change your worldview. Don't go back to the worldview of Egypt. And when you get in there to that land, do not adopt the worldview of the people all around you. It's not just a matter of changing the name on the God that you worship and we all worship the same God. Moses understands, no, you're changing your worldview. You're changing the answer to question number 1 and all these other dominoes fall in suit. And there will be disastrous consequences if you do that. This is hard in the United States, not to be influenced by popular worldviews. Okay, there's a book written by a guy named Rod Dreher. The book is called Live Not by Lies. And he makes a fascinating argument in this book. He looks at former Soviet countries, and he says these countries used to be what he calls hard totalitarian countries, meaning a totalitarian nation controls the totality of everything, including your worldview. And they tell you, this is what's true, this is what's good, this is what you value, this is what you do, this is your worldview. And they do it like the Spaniards with the indigenous folks at the end of a sword or an end of a gun or a threat of a prison sentence or whatever. You are forced to do it. Hard totalitarianism. You toe the line or we get rid of you. It's a bad place to live. It's also hard to live in what Dreher calls a soft totalitarian country. Here's how he paints the difference. He says a hard totalitarian country is often communist. There's an atheistic government that is imposing their worldview by force. In a soft totalitarian system, cultural elites and institutions impose their worldview through cultural and social and economic pressure, i.e. Pride Month. Are you going to change the logo of your company? Month of June? Are you going to be the first one to change it back at the end of June? Because we're watching. You can adopt this worldview, or there will be a consequence. They're not going to send you to jail, those companies, but they're going to shame you. It's the difference between hard totalitarianism and soft totalitarianism. The argument in the book is we already live in the soft totalitarian system now, where the cultural elites are imposing their worldview through media, through news, through lots of different things. They're imposing their worldview in soft ways. It's not at the end of a gun yet. That's the argument of the book. Yet. It may get there. You've got to resist the urge to adopt popular worldviews. It's hard when you're swimming in the ocean of Disney, Netflix, YouTube, all the rest of it. Your kids, your grandkids are swimming in that ocean. And there's a worldview being pushed, and is not a biblical worldview. Do not underestimate how hard it is for young people to live in that world and swim in that world and exist in that world, and then think that 30 minutes from me on a Sunday morning is going to inoculate them from the rest of that. That's not how it works. It's hard to resist the temptation to adopt popular worldviews. We've been talking about Revelation in Sunday school, if you're going through the Gospel Project, and we got a couple of weeks left. I know Christians get excited about Mark of the Beast type stuff, and is the tattoo going to be on the back of your hand or your forehead, or where are we doing the tattoos? What tattoo shop is doing that? And we get all psyched up about that kind of stuff. I don't think that's how it goes down at all. I think it goes down in rainbow logos. Will you adopt a non-biblical worldview for economic gain? Will you adopt a non-biblical worldview and just pretend that it's true, or just buy it wholesale for your own advantage and prosperity? That's the mark of the beast. We're looking for the tattoo on the forehead. Like, you're not going to miss it if they start tattooing foreheads, so don't worry about it. Don't adopt popular worldviews. Next, we must live a life that matches our worldview. James 1. James doesn't use the word worldview, but he says, be not hearers of the word only, but be doers. You got to be doers of the word. There's got to be this connection in your worldview. You can't have all the right pieces, but then forget that last question. What are the basic commitments in my life that I've got to make if all these other things are true? You can't disconnect that question from it. And this is where we started earlier when I told you I almost scratched that line off the notes. The way you live will ultimately tell on what your worldview actually is. So you've got to actually live in line with your worldview. No place for orthodox doctrine without changed lives. You've got to live it out. Next, we must equip the next generation with the biblical worldview. I know we've read 2 Timothy 2. You can read Psalm 78. Asaph gives you the Old Testament version of 2 Timothy 2:2. Pass down the faith to the next generation so that they can pass it down to the kids who haven't been born yet. That's a cool prayer for a church. We want to pass the gospel down to our kids so that they not only hold to it, but that they're equipped to pass it down to your great-great-grandkids who aren't even born yet. That's the call, equip the next generation. Last, vote for politicians who hold a biblical worldview. Proverbs 14:34 says, sin is a reproach to any people. Righteousness exalts a nation. These are real issues. You live in a place where you get to vote. I think the challenge is to find people who hold a biblical worldview or as close to it as you can possibly get. And you can sort out the strategic thought on, should I vote for the guy who has no chance, who holds a fully biblical worldview, or should I take 7 out of 8 because I think this guy can win? You can sort all that out. I'm just saying, as you vote and as you think about leaders in our country, you got to be thinking about people who hold a biblical worldview. Our elders read The Gathering Storm by Al Mohler. I don't know if they realized it or not. It's a worldview book. And he says in that book, Christians must realize the more enduring contest is not between rival political candidates, but between rival world views. And making the point in this book, don't get lost in the pettiness of this guy versus this guy or this gal versus that guy and all that stuff. Our political system today is being driven by worldviews that are moving in opposite directions at breakneck speed. And for a lot of years in the United States of America, Democrats and Republicans were kind of here and here, generally holding the same basic worldview assumptions, or at least outwardly pledging allegiance to those worldview assumptions. And now that's not the case anymore. And they're just moving in complete opposite directions. And you just got to know what the contest actually is. It's a worldview game. So there's your introduction to worldview. I want to mention a few things out of the Sire book. The books I ordered for you guys are 6th edition. I read the 5th edition, and I have it marked up, so I'm not moving to the new one. So I'll try to get these page numbers right because they are different. I just want to mention each week a few things about the reading I'm giving you. Not everything in this book is really easy to work through. Like there's some stuff in here you really have to think about. I know that was true when we read the preaching book, and that's certainly true in this worldview book. If you look at page 3, he tells you the purpose of the book. When you read a book, you should always look for this paragraph. And if it's a good book, this paragraph will exist somewhere. Why did this guy write this book? Number 1, to outline basic worldviews. So he's given you, a chapter on each of them. Number 2, to trace how they developed. Is really interesting how he connects some of these. Not all of them can be stacked end to end in development, but some of them can. And it's interesting to see that. Number 3, to show how postmodernism puts a twist on these worldviews. You say, well, why does he single that one out as a purpose of the book? It's because you live in a world that is dominated by that worldview today. So it's great to know, as an American in Odessa, Texas, the worldview of the Taliban in Afghanistan. That's helpful to know that. You don't live there. You live here. And the dominant worldview confronting Christians today is this postmodern worldview that he lays out in this book. 4, to encourage us all to think in terms of worldviews with a consciousness not of our own way of thought, but that of other people so that we can understand and genuinely communicate with others in a pluralistic society. So that's the purpose of the book. Look at page 6. I think this is important. He says, worldviews are a matter of the heart. This is under worldview as a commitment. It is a matter of the mind. It's also a matter of the heart. And you've got to understand that. And when you connect that with the fact that everyone has a worldview, it's not just an intellectual thing, it's a heart thing. It's an all of who you are as a human being thing. It's why God tells his people in the book of Deuteronomy, I want you to love me with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. I don't just want the intellectual belief category to be connected. I want all of it to be connected. The behavior and the values and the beliefs and the most basic worldview, all of those things have got to be connected, not just on a head level, but on a heart level. Page 12 and 13, he just kind of makes the point that the West, however you want to define that, the West used to be dominated by a Christian worldview, and it's not anymore. There is a proliferation of other worldviews. There is a dominance in certain segments of society of a postmodern worldview, a naturalistic worldview. So all of that is stuff that he lays out there. Starting as he goes through these questions, these worldview questions, there's 8 of them. I would just challenge you as you go through there and you think, okay, this is a piece of the Christian worldview. Constantly be asking yourself, where do we get this wrong as Christians in the United States? If this is a cornerstone piece of a Christian worldview, where do we get confused? Where do we go off? For example, he talks on one page, I don't have the exact page number down here, but he talks about question 4, what happens after death. And he talks about, this is what Christians believe about what happens after death. And Christians get that wrong all the time when they start talking about ghosts. And they start talking about everybody goes to heaven. Like, that's not the biblical worldview. And you can say, well, I've experienced it or whatever. But that's not the biblical worldview. And you're changing it. And Christians get that stuff wrong all the time. So anyways, chapters 1 and 2. Let me talk about week 4 for just a minute. I hope that you guys, some of you guys, will take the initiative over the next couple of months to think about worldview and to stand up and to give us some worldview analysis on the last night. So this is what it looks like. Choose a movie, TV show, song, novel, commercial, news story. That's not an exhaustive list. That's just examples, okay? Pick something in society and culture. Analyze your selection according to Sire's worldview categories, and then give us 5 to 10, preferably 5 minutes analysis of worldview. So I'll give you a quick example of kind of what I'm talking about, okay? Our church had a movie day a couple of weeks ago. We went to see Peter Rabbit 2 at the movies, okay? Let me give you some worldview analysis of Peter Rabbit 2. I could take this in a lot of different directions. I'll just focus on one thing. In one of the opening scenes, which turns out to be a dream, spoiler alert, there's people getting married in part of this scene, and it is very clearly shown that a woman is officiating the ceremony and that she has a clerical collar on, okay? It's not some old white-headed priest doing it or some pastor with the Bible. It's very clearly they're showing you, and they make a point to show in the film, this is a woman performing this ceremony, and it's not just some lady that got ordained on the internet. She's clerical. This woman is a pastor. It's a woman pastor. They're showing you that. Peter Rabbit 2. I just thought we were going to see rabbits, but we're going to see women pastors. So that's in there in the opening scene. She gets to the end of the ceremony, and everyone knows, I thought, that at the end of a wedding ceremony, you say, I think Corey said it this way when he married Logan and them, you may kiss the bride. In Peter Rabbit 2, they say to the bride, you may kiss your husband. And I heard it and I thought, why did they say that? That's backwards. That's not how you say it. They must not have consulted a pastor when they filmed this scene. No, they know what they're saying. It's very intentional. They wrote it that way on purpose. Not very long later, there's a joke about a bunny, a boy bunny, and he's telling another bunny about a friend he made. And they get confused on the name of this new friend, and the bunny, hearing the story, thinks that the boy bunny has a crush on another boy bunny, and it's sort of a little humorous thing. I don't think most of my kids caught it. There's a little joke in there where they essentially said, if you as a boy bunny want to go out with another boy bunny, that's fantastic. Good for you. Go for it. That's great. And it was so quick and it was so subtle, you just almost missed it. But if you're really listening, you think, no, did that need to be in the movie? Okay. Now, those aren't big pieces. I haven't given away the plot. I haven't told you anything like that. I haven't spoiled the ending. You can go watch Peter Rabbit 2 and you'll love it. It'll be great. But you understand that the authors, to appease a certain demographic who would raise Cain if you didn't put a certain worldview component into your film, have just dropped a few breadcrumbs to say, on the worldview question of what is a human being, men, women, this, that, today, tomorrow, pick one, choose one, it doesn't matter, it's all the same, they're interchangeable. Women can do anything men can do anything women can do. Women can probably do it better than the men, but you get the idea. They're trying to say to you something about the nature of human beings. They're trying to say to you in bunny talk something about the nature of sexuality. Anthropomorphic bunnies joking about homosexuality. They're trying to say something to you on a worldview level. They're saying to you, if a boy wants to be with a boy, great. Good for you. We're happy for you. Right? All those issues are worldview issues that they just slide in. That's the kind of stuff, it's the air your kids breathe and they don't even think about it. They watch it, they take it in, they laugh at it. Oh, that was great. What a funny movie about rabbits. And you're taking a little bit of that worldview in as you do it. So that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. Pick a song, pick a commercial. Commercials are great for worldview analysis. Pick a commercial, pick a sitcom, pick a movie, whatever. A book, and you can stand up and give us some worldview analysis on the last night. So that's the end of tonight. We got 2 more weeks before we get to your analysis. In a month, we're going to talk about the worldview question, what is a human being? And how do we make sense of that today, and why has it changed so much? I told you last week, this is the great heresy we're confronted with in our culture, in our day, in our age, is this question, worldview question of what is a human being. And really what we're going to talk about in a month is how did we as a society get so confused about that? Because we're really, really confused about it. How did we get there on that particular worldview question? Then we're going to talk about, you've heard a lot about it in the news and all sorts of stuff. We're going to spend one night talking about critical theory, which is a big giant ball of craziness, and we're going to try to undo some of those strings and pull them out and make sense of it, and it gets applied in a lot of different fields, and we'll go down a few of those roads, but not too deep. And then week 4 will be you guys. So there you go. Glad you're here. Hope you'll stick with us. Hope you'll read, watch the videos. These are important things. You live in a place where you are the minority when it comes to a worldview. And so you'd better understand yours, and you'd better understand what's floating around out there, where it's really easy to get lost in the flow of things. So let's pray and we'll be done. Lord, we love you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for a path and a light that shows us what is true and what is good, what we should value, how we should live, what we should believe, how we should think, and who we should be at the core of our being. God, we pray that we would have worldviews shaped by Scripture and not by the world. Lord, when we think about all the things happening in the world today, we're going to need courage, and we're going to need backbone, and we're going to need strength, and we're going to need wisdom to think about how we pass these truths down, these worldview truths to our kids and our grandkids, how we pass them down to the next generation in this church. God, we need wisdom in all these things, and we look to you for guidance, for resolve, for strength, and we pray that we would live our lives in a way that lines up with what your word says, that we would live our lives for you and for your glory. We pray it all in Jesus' name. Amen.